Lamar Jackson, to me, is one of the most interesting cases.
Yeah.
Here, they have built a football team around him. They have designed an offense. Greg Roman's offense is clearly built around him. They've brought in receivers, because he was the MVP. They sort of, he wasn't quite that this past year. Questions about, is he ever going to be the guy that's going to be able to pass them to a Super Bowl championship? Tell me what's going on right now, because if you're an agent for Baker Mayfield, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, you're going, hey, you guys just doubled your television money. So I don't care what Patrick Mahomes made. Double means that I should be at least where Patrick Mahomes is, if not above that, because if I don't get it now, everybody else is going to get it.
100%. And that's the thing, is that, in the quarterback market, if you're the next guy up and you've shown, enough flashes of good play, you're probably going to reset the market or come close to it. I think because Mahomes signed a decade-long contract, maybe there will be, an impetus and an effort to keep, those guys below that $45 million per year mark. If you break his contract down, Mahomes I won't get too into the details, but it's really the first 5 years kind of just surpassed Watson at about $39.5 million. And then the last 5 years were about $50.5 million and kind of met in the middle. So, I still think that they might not hit that 45, but yeah, I mean, I put, projections out for the site. I had all three of those guys surpassing Dak Prescott's $40 million per year, which I understand people think is crazy, but that's even without considering the added component that you mentioned of, in 2023, the salary cap might jump to $240 million, and those guys will know, we just gave you, 3 years of control beyond that season. If they sign the typical, 4-year extension, which we've seen for most guys, Mahomes excluded. And so they say, yeah, we might be giving you a discount, in the very near future. So it's a very interesting situation for all three because they have their question marks still. But the thing as a GM and dealing with an owner, obviously, is if you try to risk it and say, hey, we want to see more, we're not sold yet, and then Baker Mayfield, for example, and then he comes out and has a phenomenal season, both personally and that roster, which is now loaded, and they make the AFC Championship game, he's going to ask you for $5 million more per year than you could have gotten before, and that risk is a very hard one to take.
Like, do you think all three of these guys are now in this interesting game of chicken where you don't want to be the first one to sign because, okay, you might be the best paid quarterback in the NFL for 5 minutes, and then the next one is going to get $1 million a year more than you did. You want to be the last of the three to get your deal done because the other two are going to set the market for you.
100%. When I got asked to set those projections, I think my first thing I said was it's probably just going to go in. Whoever signs first will get the least, and whoever signs last will get the most. Not by a huge margin. And I think this year is also particularly interesting because traditionally the fifth-year option value was based on your draft slot. And so Mayfield him and Allen should have had a higher fifth-year option than did Lamar Jackson. But now under the new CBA, it's tied to Pro Bowls and snaps in particular. So Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen actually have a larger fifth-year option than Baker Mayfield does at first overall. So I think I would have just put Baker first, even though if you asked me to rank those three, I think I'd probably put him third. But I still would have had him at getting the highest contract just because of his draft capital and all that. But now I've kind of shifted that. But yes, it is a game of chicken. You want to go last, and you hope that the guy that goes first, that's a good benchmark because you're going to come in above it.
Talk to me about a couple of football teams that are taking a little different tack. Carolina. Right? They had every opportunity to go take a quarterback in this draft. They passed. They had signed Sam Darnold, still a very young player. Maybe they can make it work, and you get a chance to see. Detroit, right? Jared Goff. We've got to say that at least part of the reason they made the deal for Matthew Stafford was they were willing to eat the contract that the Rams didn't want to have in exchange for a couple of first-round draft picks. So we're starting to see some of the baseball stuff. The Washington football team, they could have traded up, taken a quarterback. I mean, this is clearly something they're building. Instead, they choose to build the team. Ryan Fitzpatrick comes in and will take over as the quarterback. The quarterback thing is just the entirety of the game right now, isn't it? And when you look at Carolina's situation, you had Carolina ranked 5th best cap position or cap team, whatever, because in your opinion, they're building something. They're sort of setting the deck, right? If Sam Darnold works out, great, but they're loading up on picks and capital and putting themselves in a position probably starting next year.
Yeah, so it's a great question because I think this is the next edge that teams are going to look into. Because historically, the issue is that, as I mentioned with the quarterback market, is if you had a guy who ranked in the top 20, that guy was still going to get a top of market deal. Or maybe not top 20, but top 15, top 12. And so now I think teams are looking at it and say, I can get the Kirk Cousins, the Derek Carrs of the world for, $30 million per year. Yes, they are good players with good situations around them. They can make the playoffs, but they're now starting to say, I either want a Patrick Mahomes that can carry someone on his back, or we should go to the bargain bin and we should spend, $10 million on a Ryan Fitzpatrick or even like a Cam Newton in New England, and use all that savings to, for New England to build maybe the best offensive line in football, to reinvest heavily on that defense, like they went crazy in free agency. So we're kind of seeing teams zag now to say, well, if we don't have one of those guys, we don't want to mess around in that middle tier because you're still spending a ton of money. Let's just go with the Sam Darnold, still young, still potential there, and still a year of his rookie contract left. Is he going to be as good as a Kirk Cousins? Maybe not. But he's going to cost you, 20% as much, and maybe you can make up for everything else, on the rest of the roster. So it's very interesting to see because I think it's a new trend that we're going to see continue to happen.
How about if you're the Atlanta Falcons or the New England Patriots, Sam, and what you're doing is you're too good to ever draft in the top 3 or 4 to be able to get that. So they got Mac Jones this year, New England did. But they're sort of in football purgatory, right?
There's a few teams like that.
There's no way out. You're always going to, if you take that path where you're going to build the rest of the team, you're going to come in somewhere around 500, and you're never going to draft one of those top quarterbacks, and you're never going to be bad, but you're never going to be good. And are you better off now? And we're all asking the same question, right? I mean, everybody's trying to figure this out. How would you approach it? What do you see now looking forward as the right answer? Is it always to just try to get into that top 3 like a San Francisco did? Or are you willing to take the chance of being in that 8-8 range for 10 straight years maybe?
So I think there's teams now, they're all asking exactly the same question. And I think there's a few different ways of going about it. What's ironic is that all the guys that everybody's chasing, Mahomes, Deshaun Watson, Aaron Rodgers, all those guys, none of them were drafted number 1 overall. Like those guys were actually all available in positions where these teams would have been picking. So the ironic thing is everybody's chasing one of those superstars, and you think, well, we're never going to pick in the top 3 to get one. But all the guys you're actually, when you put names to them, you actually had a shot at all those guys. You just didn't take them. But if you're not in a position to do that, I really like what Washington did in terms of, look, we'll just deal with quarterback later, right? Let's put a roster together that can actually win some things. We'll bring in a rank average quarterback. Like Ryan Fitzpatrick over the last 3 years in terms of PFF grade has graded 15th, almost exactly in the middle of the pack. There'll be some ups, there'll be some downs, but over the year, he'll shake out to about average. And if you have a really good roster around him, that's pretty good. And then maybe next year, you re-up Fitzpatrick, or maybe you don't. Maybe you get a Marcus Mariota who's suddenly a free agent, or whoever that quarterback is. There are going to be Fitzpatricks available every single year. And, remember like the 90s, the Minnesota Vikings spent like a decade just cycling through old veteran quarterbacks and doing well, like winning games, making the playoffs because they had an incredible defense. They had some talent elsewhere. And they just went, eventually we'll stumble into a Dante Culpepper at the end of the decade, I think there's some teams that are putting themselves in that position. And then there's also teams like Philadelphia where they'll say, well, we'll roll a short-term dice on Jalen Hurts, but we'll also stockpile draft picks for next year. So neither one of these first-round picks might be a high one, but together we'll have the ammunition that we can do what the 49ers did and go from the middle of the pack somewhere to the top 3.
You know, Brad, I hear that point, and there's a lot of validity to that. I look at Carolina and Denver, who drafted back-to-back, right? And Justin Fields is sitting there, Mac Jones too, but let's play the game with Justin Fields first. Clearly, they didn't have to make a move. They didn't have to trade. They didn't have to do anything. They both opted, two quarterback-needy teams, both opted for cornerback instead of quarterback in that situation. Is there something there that I'm missing? And maybe other than they just didn't like Justin Fields.
It's a great question. I struggle to say there is. I mean, even especially if you look at Denver. I mean, at that point they had already signed Ronald Darby to a substantial contract, 3 years, $30 million. You get Kyle Fuller as a cap casualty for a 1-year deal. You have Bryce Callahan in the slot. I mean, Surtain's going to be as a top 10 pick. I mean, I'm not going to say he's going to be fighting for snaps. It sounds like in camp he's already playing a lot, playing different roles. But they had a loaded secondary. I mean, they have two good safeties and, Kareem Jackson and Justin Simmons. So it has to be. I mean, I don't know. I think it had to be that they love those other guys so much. And I guess the positional value arguments that we make, I don't think anyone disagrees with quarterback. But, I think those teams had to think, hey, look, he's a good player. But we think these guys are special difference maker type players. And like Sam said, we think maybe next year, we'll be in this position again, and we can maybe trade up if we need to. But we'll kind of roll the dice again and see if it kind of works out, going forward. But it's an interesting question. Fields not only falls past those teams. I mean, he makes it to 11, but still had to get traded up to get taken. So it's a very interesting question.